I sort of want to talk today about why not just as architects, but maybe all of us should think about cities and approach cities a little bit differently. I want to start with a quote. I like to think big. I always have. To me, it's very simple. If you're going to be thinking anyway, you might as well think big. This is actually a quote by Donald Trump, surprisingly, in his book, Think Big and Kick Ass. I think that it's pretty obvious from the range of proposals and solutions and innovations that the city is, in a way, on the one hand, quite successful and succeeding, but in a way, in a moment where innovation and solutions and big thinking is really needed, not the least of which for reasons of looming climate change and the kind of environmental problems that we're facing if we continue to keep up our CO2 emissions levels and things along these lines. In that note, this is actually what the world would look like if we face a 2-degree temperature rise in the next, if we can't sort of do anything about it. So meaning lots of flooding, and the state of cities, the state of urbanization would change quite drastically. This is the cost associated with that type of event. And the costs are mostly focused on cities because cities would obviously be the most affected. So a few years ago, we passed more than 50% urbanization, and if the rate of urbanization continues, we could be almost 100% urban by 2100. So even though this seems quite drastic, it causes quite an urgency to the situation at hand. 600 centers in the world today hold more than a quarter of the population and actually generate more than 60% of global GDP. So it really is these urban centers where we want to focus on not just new blank slate solutions, but what can we do to make them more efficient and how can we learn from successful solutions that have been implemented there. As I said, they generate more than 60% of global GDP. Cities have grown to the point where some of their GDP surpasses that of countries, and actually in some cases quite large countries. So it's a very important issue in that sense as well. There are more than 500 cities that have a population of at least 1 million. And the question is actually geographically, what does this really look like? So this is a series of maps that shows this is the kind of current, the world's surface. And then this is when you take away, you only show the areas with a population of more than 25 people per square kilometer. This is only 50 people per square kilometer and 125 people per square kilometer. So the actually inhabited part of the Earth's surface begins to shrink. And what you end up with is almost a kind of archipelago of these islands of urbanized land. And in a way, it's interesting to rethink the world according to this situation, because this is where the cities are centered, and this is where the majority of our GDP is generated, the majority of our population lives. Unfortunately, this is also the areas that are most under threat in the case of this temperature rise. So again, insisting on that urgency despite the fact, or in addition to the fact, that they use over 80% of the energy that's being generated. Even with all of this well-known data, there are still skeptics who don't believe in something like global warming. Surveys continue to be published questioning whether science falsify research to support their theories on global warming, although you can question a survey that somehow adds up to 120%, I suppose. So because of this, especially in architecture and design, a lot of the solutions to this kind of crisis have been in the form of greenwashing, doing lip service to the green cause, but really little to actually address it. And in this sense, you could wonder whether thinking big and kicking ass are sort of disproportionate, that they are headed in opposite directions. Within the field of architecture, this has not always been the case. This is another quote by an architect named Buckminster Fuller, who was active in the 1960s. I like big ideas. I would describe myself as a comprehensive, anticipatory design scientist, an emerging synthesis of artist, inventor, mechanic, objective economist, and evolutionary strategist. So if this was the kind of comprehensive way that he approached the city and design and architecture, one can wonder whether we should revert to this type of macro thinking to approach the city of today. He wrote a book called The Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth, in which he described the Earth as a spaceship with a finite number of resources when once diminished would never be replaced. So again, not far off from our kind of climate crisis. Another architect in the 60s, DLDcities, who mapped and analyzed patterns of future urbanization. And again, this map isn't far off from where we sort of stand today. Instead of taking inspiration from these big thinkers, we as architects and designers and urban planners have kind of abandoned this big thinking, making our role ever more diminished. And in the meantime, in some cases, the city has become the property of others. So IKEA is building cities in London, actually. Bechtel is very, very active in the Middle East, and despite a number of protests, even in San Francisco, their activity continues to increase and grow, actually. McKinsey is planning megacities in India, and the analysis of which has little to do with spatial planning or the human scale, but they're quite successful in this. Why? Because they claim to add value. So PricewaterhouseCoopers adds value. Jones Lang LaSalle adds value. And actually what they do is they claim to add value through visions and marketing the utopias which they claim to be able to build with little or no technical expertise of how to do so. This is another example, Dubai Incorporated, which Dubai was one of the early examples of a city sort of generated almost completely out of commercial interests, mainly by the government or the rulers of the country. It was branded as a paradise and even invited people like Michael Jackson to sort of see for themselves. And they're very proud of this actually as a model, claiming at some of these fairs and expos that one day all cities will be built like this. Question again is whether or not that's a good thing. Another example is Songdo, the first city that was designed and built as an international business district, actually, and branded as high-tech, flashy, sparkling, and new. But one can again wonder just how smart is Songdo. It seems that these cities essentially completely ignore their context and again are kind of blank slate insertions into a kind of new ground rather than responding to the city as it is, the city as it exists. So maybe instead of visions, what we should do is return to a state where we look at comprehensive and interdisciplinary planning, models which also look at the dark side of the city, so not just the flashy and the new, but what, even in terms of informal economies, maybe bottom-up political solutions, alternative financial models, biology or science as fields which provide technological solutions. And in this sense, the architect, him or herself, is no longer the sole proprietor of the city, and the city is no longer the sole property of the architect, so it requires this sort of interdisciplinary approach to work. The city has become a sort of organism operating outside of the boundaries which we even set for it. So we need to be flexible in that sense to accommodate this, to approach the city holistically and through an interdisciplinary approach. I want to spend a little bit of time on a few projects that we've done. I don't claim that we have kind of cracked this model of how to approach the city moving forward or how to create this type of comprehensive proposal, but there's some work that we've been doing over the last few years that has elements of it, so I just wanted to try and extract some components from a few projects that might describe a little bit more clearly what I'm trying to suggest. The first is a project called Roadmap 2050, which was actually commissioned by NGO, a European NGO, to describe a roadmap for how Europe could reduce its carbon emissions 80% by 2050. We did the project in a consortium of 13 companies with a wide range of disciplines and a wide range of expertise. The technical basis for the project is that all sectors have to be addressed: power, road, air and sea transport, industry, buildings, waste, and agriculture. And further to that, all renewable energy sources need to be considered, and we proposed a kind of thorough energy mix. But perhaps more importantly was the political and kind of lobbying component of the whole thing. So there was a kind of feasibility study done, and we have a very concrete proposal for how it could happen, but maybe more importantly, in addition to this, we actually made policy recommendations and assessed essentially the economic impact of doing so to suggest that this complete European integration was needed to make the project feasible. So it had a very strong political component to the whole thing, which sort of resulted in a technical, financial, and policy proposal showing how the project could be implemented on a European scale. So it was a collaboration in the end of kind of architect, engineer, economist, policymakers, all in one piece, which is, I think, a rare situation. We were able to kind of expand our network a bit and expand the competencies with which we approach the problem of infrastructure planning and design. A second project in 2012, we participated in a project in Moscow, which had just expanded its municipal borders to 2.5 times their previous size, and wanted to know how they should approach this type of development, or how this should be addressed or understood. We again participated in a consortium of companies together with Siemens, among others. And the interesting thing was that central to our proposal in terms of the urban fabric and the spatial planning for the city center was not necessarily what the buildings should specifically look like, but actually a reorganization of the land use categories. So it was a kind of shift within the bureaucratic infrastructure that allowed for more flexibility and further use. Essentially, this allowed the working informal systems that had been set up by the citizens themselves to be maintained. So this was the former land use categories, and this is after the shift. And the structural revision of these categories, following this, essentially both the government and the citizens could capture the benefits of this type of system. In addition to this, we spent a lot of time looking at the transport infrastructure, and so on top of this land use change, we're able to propose within the reform territory a sustainable transport infrastructure which capitalized both on new technology but was also able to fit into the already existing fabric and the already existing systems of the city. So again, expanding our network and again expanding our sort of mode of collaboration and approaching the city from multiple fronts rather than just one. The last project I want to show was an initiative of actually the U.S. Housing and Urban Development, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which was called Rebuild by Design. And it took place at the end of last year and was a proposal for what to do to increase the resilience of the areas affected by Hurricane Sandy. What was interesting from our side is that we were able to approach this as planners with lots of experience in water and in resilience of kind of water-based cities from the Netherlands. So the interesting thing about our consortium, again, was bringing sort of traditional expertise coupled with a very geographically specific type of expertise to essentially identify the areas of maximum impact and then say what the key factors were to be in order to address these areas and make proposals on that basis as a kind of integrated team or under an integrated system. So again, sort of expanding the network and the people with which it's typical now that we sort of work. So I guess in the end, the network has become very rich, and we sort of feel that it's the beginning of trying to understand what's needed to address the complexity of the city today. And as the population sort of continues to urbanize and this becomes more and more our reality in terms of where people are living and where people are existing, maybe we can start to look at it as actually an archipelago, take a model from the Greek polis. And just as politics were needed to address the polis, maybe we can start to embrace this interdisciplinary approach and look towards megalopolitics in the age of the megacity. Thank you very much.